In 1920, British and French officials drew a straight line from Acre to Kirkuk, birthing modern Iraq overnight. It was ruled by just 3,000 civil servants. This was not random. It was a chain reaction that made fragile states the Middle East's default. Why did new borders and weak institutions lead to mass displacement, cycles of violence, and no lasting peace? The real turning point is not found in ancient rivalries, but in a Cold War arms flood that hardened conflict logic across the region. By the end, you will see why durable peace here remains so rare, and what structural traps keep it that way. In a cramped map room in London, 1916, Sir Mark Sykes took a pencil and drew a straight line from Acre on the Mediterranean to Kirkuk in northern Mesopotamia. That single stroke, later known as the Acre to Kirkuk line, became the backbone of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret deal dividing the Middle East between Britain and France. The line paid little attention to the languages, religions, or loyalties of the people living beneath it. Instead, it was about oil, ports, and keeping rival empires in check. French officials carved out Lebanon from the Syrian coast, expanding its borders to include the Bekaa Valley, Tripoli, and southern districts, folding in large Muslim populations alongside the Maronite Christian heartland. General Gouraud's 1920 proclamation declared Greater Lebanon a haven for Christians, but the boundary lines ensured long-term sectarian tension. Meanwhile, the British merged 3 Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, into a single new country called Iraq. The decision lumped together Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds under one flag, despite their different histories and ambitions. British records show the goal was a state that could be influenced from afar, not one built on local consensus. The new government relied on a small cadre of loyalists, with real authority held by British advisors and military power. Palestine, too, was mapped out for international administration, left as Zone Brown on the Sykes-Picot chart, its fate unresolved and its borders provisional. The logic behind these lines was not stability, but manageability, frontiers drawn for imperial convenience, not for the people who would live with them. Every straight border and patchwork merger made future conflict almost inevitable. The question became, what happens when states are born before their societies are ready to share them? Mandate officials arriving in Baghdad and Beirut faced a daunting challenge: how to govern vast territories with almost no local machinery. In the early 1930s, the entire civil service in Iraq numbered about 3,000 officials, for a population nearing 3 million. French and British administrators relied on a handful of trusted allies, often drawn from favored families or minority communities, to fill the gaps. Tax collection reached only a fraction of the economy, about 12% in Iraq, leaving budgets so thin that basic services barely functioned outside key cities. Most rural areas saw little more than a distant flag, an occasional tax collector, or a police patrol. Without broad-based institutions or a sense of national identity, these new governments struggled to command loyalty. King Faisal of Iraq famously admitted, "An Iraqi people does not yet exist in Iraq," describing the country as a collection of tribes and sects, not a nation. In Syria and Lebanon, the French stitched together regions with different sectarian balances, but left behind a patchwork of local councils and provisional assemblies with little real power. The result was a system where formal authority existed on paper, but practical control depended on personal networks, patronage, or the threat of force. Pattern interrupt. When a state can't tax or staff its own offices, it often turns to coercion to survive. This logic, survival by force rather than consent, would shape the region's politics for decades. It fueled a cycle where weak legitimacy made compromise risky and repression tempting. The next question: what happens when outside powers start arming these fragile states? Early rulers in Baghdad, Damascus, and Beirut faced a stark reality. Keeping power meant keeping order, and order relied on force. With barely enough tax revenue to cover the basics, state budgets in Iraq and Syria tilted heavily toward security. In Iraq, by the late 1930s, spending on the army and police swallowed the largest share of government funds, often outpacing investments in schools, clinics, or roads. French mandate records from Syria reveal a similar pattern, with military outlays consistently exceeding social spending, even as rural areas remained underserved. The logic was simple. When a state cannot collect enough taxes or staff its offices, it falls back on what it can control: guns, uniforms, and loyal officers. Pattern, interrupt. In these new states, the army often came before the nation. Rulers recruited from trusted families or minority groups, offering them positions in the security services while sidelining rivals. This approach kept central authority intact, but it also deepened divisions and left broad swathes of the population feeling excluded. Instead of building shared civic identities, governments built networks of surveillance and patronage, rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent. The consequences went beyond politics. When millions were displaced by war, whether Kurds in the north or Palestinians in exile, the newcomers rarely found a place in the state's core institutions. Instead, their presence reinforced the habit of ruling by exclusion and suspicion. Over time, security-first governance became a habit, shaping everything from school funding to who got a government job. The result? States that looked strong on paper, but struggled to command real loyalty. The next pressure point is how these patterns played out when outside powers began flooding the region with weapons and support. In 1948, more than 700,000 refugees fled or were expelled from their homes during the Arab-Israeli War. Most ended up in makeshift camps across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, and Gaza. These were not just temporary shelters, they became permanent fixtures, with families living under canvas, then corrugated roofs, as decades passed. The camps grew into dense towns, packed with children and memories of lost villages. In Jordan, the government eventually granted citizenship to most refugees, but in Lebanon and Syria, many remained stateless, barred from most jobs and public services. Each camp developed its own leadership committees, often run by elders or former village heads, but younger generations began forming activist groups. By the 1950s, camp politics turned outward. In Gaza and the West Bank, young men joined Fedayeen units, launching cross-border raids into Israel. In Lebanon, the camps became organizing hubs for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which grew into a major armed movement by the late 1960s. Pattern interrupt. The camps were never just about shelter. They became engines of political mobilization, linking displaced families across borders. Refugee grievances did not fade, they spread, creating networks that cut across the region. The presence of these camps changed the politics of every host country. In Lebanon, the influx unsettled the delicate sectarian balance. In Jordan, Black September in 1970 saw the army clash with Palestinian factions, threatening the monarchy itself. Over time, the unresolved status of millions of refugees kept the idea of return alive, fueling cycles of protest, recruitment, and at times, armed struggle. Each new generation inherited the memory of lost homes, making the refugee question not just a humanitarian issue, but a permanent source of regional tension. The next layer in the conflict stack is how these grievances fed the logic of militarization, as states and non-state groups armed themselves for the battles ahead. By the early 1950s, the Middle East became a prized arena for the Cold War arsenals. United States and Soviet Union powers poured billions of dollars worth of weapons into the region, transforming border disputes and internal rivalries into arms races. United States shipments sent fleets of F-16 fighters and battalions of M-60 tanks to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, while Soviet cargo planes delivered MiG fighters and T-55 tanks to Syria, Iraq, and Libya. SIPRI data tallies over $100 billion in arms transfers to the region between 1950 and 1990, more than 20% of the world's major weapons exports in that era. In 1973 alone, during the Yom Kippur War, the Soviet Union airlifted more than 1,000 tanks and hundreds of aircraft to its Arab allies, while the United States responded with a massive resupply to Israel. These supply routes did not just bolster armies, they cemented the military as the backbone of state power, locking fragile governments into cycles of dependency and escalation. The next layer is how these arsenals shaped the very institutions meant to keep the peace. By the 1960s, armies and secret police were not just enforcing the rules, they were writing them. In Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, military officers moved from the barracks to the presidential palace, often toppling civilian leaders in quick-fire coups. The region's security agencies, many built with help from Soviet or Western advisors, became the state's eyes and ears, tracking dissent and rewarding loyalty. The Mukhabarat in Iraq, Savak in Iran, and Syria's multiple intelligence branches grew into sprawling institutions, controlling jobs, housing, and even access to education. With so much power concentrated in uniformed hands, compromise came to look like weakness. Political opponents risked arrest, exile, or worse, making negotiation a gamble few dared to take. Over time, the logic of force hardened. The more the state relied on coercion, the less space there was for genuine political give and take. In this system, the cost of backing down was often higher than the cost of confrontation. Today, 1 in 4 people in the Middle East lives in a country facing armed conflict or foreign intervention. Durable peace remains rare, not for lack of will, but because the system rewards survival over compromise. Until incentives shift, instability remains the rule, not the exception. What would change that?